I am super excited to be here today to kick off A11y Camp with a talk I like to call the Great Accessibility Bake-Off. So thank you for that introduction. As you mentioned, I'm Cordelia. I go by Cordelia Dillon on the internet. That's Dillon. And I'm a web accessibility engineer. I just rejoined Salesforce this past month, so getting situated in there. And today we're talking about accessibility. So for those of you who, hopefully everyone in this room kind of knows what accessibility is or is here to learn about that today. There are a bunch of different definitions of accessibility, but my favorite is this one. Accessibility is about making products, services, and spaces that everyone can use and enjoy in all contexts, regardless of their abilities. So accessibility is really about providing the best possible experience, regardless of situational or permanent impairments. And when we talk about accessibility on the web, we tend to think about that in 4 overlapping dimensions that we'll talk about a little bit more later on today. So those 4 dimensions of human experience on the web are visual. So we've got everything from someone who's blind or colorblind to someone who's just in a really poor lighting situation, or maybe their phone is really low on battery, so they've turned the brightness super far down. So vision can be a permanent condition or a temporary condition. We've got motor. Really what this kind of comes down to is how is someone interacting with the products you're creating? Are they using speech control? Are they using a switch? Are they, we often think that most users are using a mouse, but a lot are using a keyboard or some other form of input to interact with your UIs. Does someone have a routine stress injury or fine motor control issues? Are they multitasking? How many hands do they have available to perform a task? Then there's also auditory. Is someone hard of hearing or deaf? Are they in a loud space? Did they forget to bring their headphones and want to watch an embarrassing video at work? There's all sorts of situational and temporary things around the auditory space. And then the other large bucket when we're thinking about accessibility on the web is cognitive accessibility. So thinking about people who are dyslexic or autistic, people who are unfamiliar with the system context, right? For example, are we using iconography that our users don't actually understand? Or one of my favorite examples is, does someone know the language? If someone doesn't know, if someone, just speaks English and goes to a Spanish-speaking country, that's an accessibility barrier right there. So with these 4 different lenses, we're really trying to create really flexible systems that consider all users' experiences from the very start and not just via tacked-on accommodations. Which brings me to my favorite phrase. How many people have heard this phrase about baking accessibility in rather than tacking it on at the end? Okay, we've got 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, many hands in this room. And for folks who might not be able to see my screen, I've been illustrating a lot of these slides. So here I've got some cookies on a baking tray, and the cookies spell out baking accessibility in. So this is my favorite metaphor, and I like to just take it really far and do whole conference talks about it. So let's just consider, in the non-metaphorical sense, let's consider that you are going to your niece's birthday party and you know that she loves muffins. And so you've baked these really beautiful muffins for her. They're nice and warm, fresh out of the oven. They look delicious, they smell delicious, they taste delicious. But then you've forgotten that actually blueberry muffins are her favorite. She doesn't like plain muffins. She really wanted blueberry muffins, and you totally forgot to put the blueberries in. So you're about to go to this party to make blueberry muffins, but you've left them out. So you start frantically jamming the blueberries into the muffin with your fingers, and you end up with something that looks a little bit like this, maybe a little bit juicier. So you've got a crumply muffin that is not very appealing looking. It is technically a blueberry muffin, right? This is a muffin. It has blueberries in it. Therefore, it's a blueberry muffin, but it's not actually a very good blueberry muffin. It doesn't have that feeling of like the blueberries kind of melting in when they were baked in. It's kind of sad, and you really don't want to present this to anyone. So this happens a lot with web accessibility. So let's consider, instead of this blueberry muffin, let's consider a button on the web. So here I have a purple button that says set timer. So a lot of times on the web, you might come across something that looks like this, and the code looks something like this. So it's a div. It has class equals button primary, so it looks like a button. It has an on-click event that sets a timer, and it works really great with a mouse, right? Like, it looks like a button. It functions like a button when I click on it. But gosh, I can't get to it with my keyboard. So okay, I'll add a tab index to that. So I've added tab index equals 0, which means that I can now tab to this element, this button on the page. And now if I press enter or space on it, which is the expected interaction for a button, nothing happens. So okay, I'll add an on key down handler to it and say, whenever someone presses the space key or the enter key, I'm going to set the timer in the same way that I set it when they click it. So cool, now I've basically jammed in blueberries with each one of these properties. I've got a button thing. I've got a thing that I can tab to and press enter on to perform an action. I can click on it to perform an action. It's cool, but to a screen reader user, there's still nothing about this that says, hey, I'm a button. So we can add a role attribute to this and say, the role of this thing is a button. So now it looks like a button. It functions like a button. It also identifies itself as a button, but we've taken 3 extra attributes and a bunch of extra JavaScript to do something that we could have baked in from the very beginning. We could have just used a button element and added an on-click to it that said, hey, set timer when I click this button. And sure, buttons are ugly by default, but we could use some CSS to style it to look pretty nice. So that being said, I'm going to continue to roll with this baking metaphor. And here I've got a rolling pin rolling out some, I would say, like fondant on the screen here, so an illustration of a rolling pin. So how do we bake accessibility in by default? How do we make it not just this tacked on series of attributes or extra interactions that we're throwing on at the end, but how do we really approach it from the very beginning? And taking this metaphor, I'm going to jump a little bit to my favorite TV show, which is The Great British Bake Off. Does anyone watch this show or the Australian equivalent? All right, we've got like another like 7 to 8 hands. Cool, and we've got some laughter. Yay, it's the morning. Okay, so I love this show. Here on the screen here, I've got little smiley faces with heart eyes around one of the promotional posters of the show. So for those who aren't familiar with it, it's basically a reality competition television show. So a bunch of amateur bakers, and here's a photo of all of them being really happy on screen here. A bunch of amateur bakers compete each week in 3 separate challenges, which we'll get into in a second, to find out who is like the top amateur baker. And the show is abundantly charming. It's really, really lovely. All of them are judged by these 2 professional bakers, Paul Hollywood and Mary Berry. And I'm rambling on about this show because today what I'd like to do is a sample episode of the Great Accessibility Bake Off. Because I think every day as web creators, whether we've signed up for it or not, and maybe not all of you work in web, but for those of us who are working on products of any kind, we're contestants in the Great Accessibility Bake Off. We're constantly undertaking these accessibility challenges with every single interface that we build or design. And one of the things that I really love about this Bake Off show is it's not like they're all professional bakers who do this for a living. No, they're people who are passionate about it and do it as part of their lives, and that's how we should approach accessibility. You don't have to be an accessibility expert in order to create great accessible UIs, and I hope that if you're coming into this conference fresh to accessibility, you walk out feeling empowered. Like, you don't need to totally change your title. You just need to kind of bake it into everything that you do. So all you really need to make accessible UIs is to be comfortable with basic techniques, and then be willing to step out of your comfort zone when necessary. So today, we are going to walk through this imaginary episode of the Great Accessibility Bake Off, and instead of all of these folks on the screen here being the contestants, we will all be the contestants. And instead of these two charming professional British bakers judging every single thing we make, really our users are the judges, right? But an interesting thing is, instead of contestants winning or losing, the users themselves are the ones who win or lose. Because if we're creating UIs that don't work for every type of user, they're missing out on a really great experience. And on this screen here, I've got illustrations of 6 different stick figures who are all using different input devices to interact with the screen. So I've got someone using a mouse and they're super happy, but then someone who's using a phone is unhappy, and then we've got another unhappy person using a refreshable braille display. We've got someone using speech dictation software, someone multitasking by using their computer with their non-dominant hand and holding a cup of coffee, and then someone using a switch control to control their iPad. So if we're not thinking about accessibility at the very beginning, we might be leaving behind a lot of these users. Alternately, if we're doing this right, we are making them all happy. So I've switched all the frowns into happy smiles. So before we start this show, before we start pleasing all of these users, we need to do a little bit of prep work and talk about the main ingredients of accessible websites. And for that, I'm going to put on my apron. 1 second. Don't want to ruin my great conference badge. Okay, so the main ingredients of accessible web design and development. You will need, hold on, I'm just tightening it. Semantic HTML, a dash of ARIA, alt attributes for images, names for all interactive items, sufficient text contrast, and mouse keyboard parity. And you can read about all of these and more in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which hopefully you're familiar with. If you're not, they're a great set of guidelines that most everyone tries to follow to make the most accessible and wonderful websites possible. So I'm not going to go in depth into each one of these, but I'm going to jump into a few of them. I see some phones up, taking photos. I'll wait. Okay. We've got one more. Cool. Okay. So let's start with semantic HTML. So semantic HTML is the core ingredient for accessible web UIs. So here I've got this illustration of a really happy ice cream cone that's full of semantic HTML components, and then some really sad melted ice cream on the ground. And the melted ice cream on the ground is a div, it's a span, it's an anchor without an href. It's these HTML elements who alone, they don't carry any meaning about what their purpose is on the page, versus in this super tall happy ice cream cone that just looks so cute. We've got a button, which, as we talked about earlier, conveys to the user just by being a button element, like its expected functionality. It has all this built-in interactions. It tells you its role, all this great stuff. We've got elements like article, main, nav, section that help people understand the structure of a web page. We've got a table, UL, LI, all of these elements that, when you use them correctly, communicate to assistive technology users, like, hey, this is the structure of this web page. This is how all of this information relates to one another, versus if you just had a page that was full of divs, where no element on its own has any sort of meaning about what it does. So we'll get into that a little bit shortly. So the interesting thing about semantic HTML is, like, ideally you could just build a whole great website just using semantic HTML, but as we're finding is like more and more websites are becoming web apps. And there are a lot of interaction patterns and just like rich details to web design that weren't part of HTML when HTML was created. So we need to spice that up with a dash of ARIA to really convey the interactions and the roles and all of these things to our users. So what is ARIA? ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. You can read all about that on the W3 websites, ARIA 1.1 documentation. And ARIA is basically a set of HTML attributes. These HTML attributes communicate additional information about the role, state, and properties of each element on the page that you use it on. And it's really helpful for assistive technology to understand how to interact with these components, what they are, what their current state is, when basic semantic HTML won't suffice. I like to think of ARIA a little bit like cinnamon, in that if you just throw a ton of it on, it can be excessive and unwanted and kind of make things worse. Like, I don't know if you've ever tried the whole like spoon of cinnamon challenge, but that's not pleasant. Don't just eat a spoonful of cinnamon ever. So ARIA is really useful when you're using it correctly, and using it to enhance these experiences, but you don't want to just throw ARIA willy-nilly all over everything. It's really useful for larger interaction patterns, and we'll get to that shortly as well. And then using alternative text is another key ingredient for accessible web UIs. There are basically two different types of alternative text for images. There's informational, where if you have, say, here I have an illustration of a cupcake, I'm going to give that image an alt attribute of cupcake, just a short descriptive alt text. But informational alt text is also context sensitive, right? So here I've got two cupcakes next to each other and they're slightly different. So instead of just saying alt equals cupcake, I'm going to say alt equals cupcake with cherry on top for the first image, and alt equals cupcake with sprinkles for the second image. So context matters here. And then you also have images that are redundant or decorative where you don't need to provide alt text. You still need to say, hey, screen reader, you can ignore this by putting alt equals empty string or aria hidden equals true, to let the screen reader know that, hey, this isn't just like a really important image that I've forgotten to mark up. It's an image that's not really essential for understanding this page. So in my example here, I've got an illustration of a cupcake right next to the visual word cupcakes, and it would be pretty redundant to have it say cupcakes. So using alt text wisely is a key ingredient for accessibility. And then good text contrast is another key ingredient. So the WCAG guidelines have some specified ratios for color contrast, which are 4.5 to 1 for regular text and 3 to 1 for large text. What does that even mean? I mean, no one can really do these calculations in their head, so there are a bunch of websites you can go to type in your color contrast, your two different colors, and find out if they pass. So on the screen here, I've got a bunch of strings of text starting in black and going down into a light gray, and I'm curious, where do you think, if you can see the screen, shout out what is the last line that you can see? Do you like chocolate? Okay. So there are actually two lines below it. One says, can you still see me? And the other one says, shout cupcake, if you can read this. No one shouted cupcake. So it's interesting. So there are maybe like 10 lines of text here. But if I actually figure out the contrast ratios and which ones pass, only the top 3 pass for WCAG guidelines. So on this projector screen, we're able to see pretty far down, but on another type of screen, it might, the colors might be more washed out. If someone has some form of low vision, a lot of these could be washed out for them, so we only want to use those top 3. So let's start jumping into our show now that we've talked about all the ingredients. So what is the judging criteria that we're going to follow? Well, in the Great British Bake Off, the judging criteria is, does it look amazing? Does it taste amazing? And is it well baked? Obviously, we're not going to be like licking HTML elements because that would be weird. So we're going to figure out, does it look amazing? Sure, because we don't want to make accessible UIs that are ugly. We want to make accessible UIs that are fun and interesting to use. Does it function as expected? And did you over or under engineer it? Did you throw way too much ARIA on there when you really could have just used a semantic element? So as part of figuring out if we're doing it right, we're going to test everything that we make with a mouse, a keyboard, a screen reader, multiple screen readers. There are 3 that are pretty highly recommended. That's NVDA for Windows, JAWS for Windows, and VoiceOver, which is built into OS X. Test with grayscale mode, we'll get to that shortly. And test with real users, because ultimately real users are who we care about. You know, you can follow every single guideline in the book and make a UI that is not actually pleasant for anyone to use. So really make sure that you're testing with real people. So let's just jump into our first challenge. Let me put on my hat. So our signature challenge. So the signature challenge is the first challenge in the Great British Bake Off and in our Great Accessibility Bake Off. So the signature challenge, and I'm going to read directly from the Great British Bake Off website, is a challenge that tests the baker's personality, creative flair, and baking ability. The main challenge here is to produce something cute, rustic, and altogether homemade looking. It is in this test that the bakers get to show off their tried and tested hand-cooked bites. So what is more tried and tested on the web than a form? Yeah? So pretty much every website has a form. Let's talk about how to make the best, most accessible form. So what ingredients do you need? First, you need the fields themselves. So in this form here, it's kind of blurry, so I'll read out the slides to you all, but picture I've actually got a form element around this. I've got 2 input fields for 2 text input fields, a checkbox input field, and then a input type submit for submitting the form. So I've got the fields themselves. Now I need to add associated visual labels. So I can do that pretty easily by putting a label element next to each input field and using the for attribute of the label to link it to the input field's ID. And that's really important that you use this for attribute to link the 2 together, partly because that's how assistive technology like screen readers will know when I tab to the name field that it should read out name, but also for things like this checkbox here that says, yes, I want to be a contestant on the Great Accessibility Bake Off. If I don't have enough dexterity to click on the checkbox itself to check it, I can click on the whole label, and that should be able to toggle the checkbox for me. So that's another reason why it's really important to associate labels and inputs. Never, never, never use placeholders as labels. For many reasons. First of all, placeholder text, as you can see here, it says, or maybe you can't see it, right? It says name in this first field and email in the second field. And placeholder is so low contrast that a lot of folks can't see it. I'm having trouble seeing it on the screen here. So if you make it higher contrast, then it just looks like a filled in field, which no one wants. So place those labels outside of the forms. Another issue with placeholder text is as soon as you type in them, the label goes away. How are you supposed to know what you are even typing there? A lot of screen readers will not know as soon as you type in the text, they will no longer read out placeholder text, and users might not remember what's in there. So let's put those labels outside of the form field and properly associate them. The third thing we'll need is visible focus indicators. So it's pretty common so the default focus halo on websites is really ugly, and a lot of times people just want to get rid of it by saying focus, outline none. But then you run into this issue of, how do I know where my focus is in this field? How do I know that I have focus on this input field? So you can totally remove the default as long as you put in your own special one. So here I've replaced this focus halo, the default one, with my own custom box shadow that is like a purple that matches the colors of my slides. So that's pretty easy to do. The fourth thing we'll need is associated errors. This is a great moment to use a little dash of ARIA. So here I've got this email field that has an error below it that says email addresses must include an @ sign. And rather than just sticking that span right below the input field, I want to associate the input with this error. So I can use this ARIA describe by attribute on the input field to link it to the error span, so when, say, a screen reader reaches this email field, they'll hear maybe like Cordelia email field or Cordelia email text, and then it'll say email address must include an @ sign. The fourth thing here is associate errors. The fifth element of accessible form design is making sure that you're not just using color alone to convey meaning. So if we look at this error text, it's red, right? But if I just do grayscale mode on everything, you'll notice that now this text is kind of gray. I'm not sure if it's an error or not. So I can pop in a little icon. So here I've got this exclamation point inside of my form field. So now if I'm looking at it in grayscale mode, I can still tell there's something wrong with it. You can also create, if you don't like the default styles of, say, radio buttons or checkboxes, sometimes people just want to like rip them out and replace them with divs. There's actually some really great and elegant ways to keep them there and style them with like off-screen elements, which I won't get into now, but it's possible. So that was challenge number 1. If we follow all of those guidelines, we should create a pretty solid bake. So let's move on to the technical challenge. So the technical challenge is one where typically what happens is that the bakers are given a set of they're given a recipe, but it's missing some key information, like how long are you supposed to bake this for? Or, it's just totally missing certain steps. And the bakers have to rely on their own knowledge of how to bake to make it a really great accessible bake. So let me grab my whisk 1 second. So for our technical challenge, what are we going to do? For our technical challenge, we're going to kick it up a notch and make a slightly more interactive component than a forum, and we're going to create a tree view. So here I've got an example from Dropbox of a tree view with folders and nodes that can expand and collapse. Each node in this tree is selectable. So how do we know how to build this the right way? Well, first, kind of going through our core ingredients, we're going to think about semantic HTML. Unfortunately, our tried and true semantic HTML isn't going to work because while we can create nested lists with HTML, we can't create these nested interactive lists that are expandable, collapsible, selectable. All of that stuff can't be conveyed just with standard semantic HTML. So that's when we're going to go and follow the ARIA recipe. So if you go to the ARIA documentation, they have a lot of really useful information. So here I'm looking at the ARIA authoring practices 1.1. I see that tree view is in the sidebar there. So I click on tree view and I get a whole big, rich amount of information about how do you make an accessible tree on the web. It's got information about keyboard shortcuts. It's got information about it's a little blurry, about what is this? ARIA attributes, and it's even got a list of examples. So ideally, you should be able to follow this word by word and create the most accessible tree view, hopefully. Sometimes it's not the case, though. Sometimes I follow the ARIA specs word for word, and there's still something a little bit missing. And then I'm stuck trying to figure out how, there's a bug, it's not reading out properly to my screen reader. Why is this the case? Is it an issue with my code? Is it an issue with the browser? Or is it an issue with the screen reader, or some strange combination of the three? And that can be really challenging when you're new to accessibility because there are so many factors at play. So how do you figure out what to do if it's not working? Well, same as most debugging, I Google it, but first I double check the spec, because the ARIA spec is like the single source of truth. So you follow that, see if you've missed anything, you double check your code, and then you do Google it, and you try to find out how to fix it. You can check for known bugs in browsers and screen readers. There's a really great website called whoseline.a11yideas.com where you can actually, that gives you tips on how do you debug when you have an accessibility issue and you're not sure if it's at the browser level or the screen reader level or what. So that's great. And then you can also ask around. There's a really awesome Slack community, if any of you use Slack, called the Web Accessibility Community. You can get to it by typing web-a11y.herokuapp.com. And if you go to that website, you can sign up for the Slack org and meet hundreds of people who are all working on accessibility and have probably run into that same weird special use case that you have. In my case with the tree view, I was running into an issue when I was working at Dropbox of we did the tree view to spec. It looked great. It worked really well with the NVDA screen reader. It didn't work well with VoiceOver, and we were totally stuck. So we Googled it. We found this really great article called Not So Simple ARIA tree views and screen readers. And through that and through talking with people, we discovered that we needed to add an extra ARIA label attribute. So we ended up writing code mostly to spec here, where we have basically a div with role of tree, and within it, it's got elements with tree item roles and ARIA to say hey, I'm expanded, hey, I'm selected, but we also added an ARIA label to each of the nodes, and that fixed our bug for us. Basically, to make sure that you're making the most accessible UIs, you gotta read the spec, try it out. If that fails, ask around, and hopefully you'll get a good solution. So we were able to get something that worked really, really well, and that would satisfy our users, our judges. So for our final challenge, we're going to do the showstopper challenge. I realize I'm running a little bit over time, so it's going to be a very exciting rapid fire showstopper challenge, for which I will take out my wooden spoon. So the showstopper challenge is when you really want to create something super impressive. This is like the chance to go big or go home. And I think a great example of that on the web is drag and drop. If anyone's tried to implement drag and drop in an accessible way before, you may have heard people actually say, is it even possible? Some people think it's mind-boggling because there's all these things to consider, like precision, keyboard support, screen reader support. A lot of times people have been shocked by the idea of accessible drag and drop, but it's really not that complicated when you think about it. So if you think less about the method of drag and drop and think more about the outcome, drag and drop is really about moving something. Drag and drop, dragging something with your mouse is one way to move something, but there are so many other ways that you could do that. So when you think about moving things, there are kind of three different general categories of moving things. There's putting something into a bucket. So here I've got this cupcake that I'm moving into the Eat Now bucket. There's rearranging lists. So here I'm ranking desserts and moving cupcake up and down. And then there's moving on a canvas. So I'm moving this cupcake image around. And for each one, you can use drag and drop, but you could also do a bunch of other different types of moving patterns. So for example, if we talk about moving things into buckets, one example that I love from Salesforce is the opportunity Kanban view. So here we've got basically a bunch of opportunities in your Salesforce org that are in lists, sorted in lists according to their stage. And if you want to move something from one stage to another, you click and drag it into another stage. But you could also do this really easily with a keyboard. If you want to move this particular card from this one view into another list, you can press the spacebar on it to put it in drag mode, and then you get a drop-down menu of all of the different columns that you can drop it into. You can use your arrow keys to navigate through that list of columns, select the one that you want. You can even use type ahead to jump down to the one that you want, and then you just press enter on whichever column, and it moves it in there. So that is a pretty simple pattern of you press space to pick it up, use your arrow keys to figure out what column you want to drop it into, and enter to put it there. You can also we have some extra hidden text for screen reader users that tells them what to expect of this interaction, so they know exactly what to do. Rearranging a list can also be pretty similar. You could just press space on the element that you want to move, use your arrow keys to move it up and down, and then press space to drop it. Along the way, you can have screen reader notifications that'll tell the user, hey, press spacebar to select and move. Hey, this thing is grabbed, current position 1 of 5. You drop this thing, final position 3 of 5. Pretty easy stuff. You may be wondering, what about ARIA? Because I was talking about how ARIA is super useful for these situations where semantic HTML won't suffice. So an interesting thing about ARIA drag and drop is that there used to be authoring practices in the old version of ARIA that told you how to implement drag and drop in an accessible way. These patterns have disappeared in ARIA 1.1, which is the latest version of ARIA, and the attributes that they had, ARIA grabbed and ARIA drop effect, were deprecated. So you may be like, how do I do this without ARIA? But it seems like there are ways to do it, like those 2 examples that I showed before. You can use this hidden text approach. You can also just use multiple different ways to move something. Like in Dropbox, you can drag and drop files around to move them between folders. But you could also press the move button in the right corner up here, and that'll pop up the tree view that we created in the last challenge, and you can navigate that tree view with your arrow keys and select where you want to drop something. So there are tons of different ways to move something around. You can get creative with it. You can add the delete key to move it into the deleted bucket. You can use cut, copy, paste to move things around. For positioning, you can use arrow keys. You can use input fields. Really, drag and drop is just one way to move something around. There are tons of different ways to do it. So what this challenge comes down to, and what all these challenges really come down to, is giving a user's choice and flexibility. They'll decide which methods are best for them. Hopefully you're going to implement everything so that it works with a keyboard and with a mouse. So if you've implemented all of this stuff, perhaps, is it great? Is it great? I don't know. The only way to know for sure is to show your UI to users, use semantic HTML, use ARIA only when you have to, and hopefully you'll create something great and be the winners of the Great Accessibility Bake Off. Cool. Thank you.